Hello and welcome to this Musical Notes Getting Started course on Toontrack's EZDrummer 3. Musical notes, we make the notes, you make the music. Though this course is designed for absolute beginners to EZDrummer, I feel existing or established users will still get insight into the software too. So if you've used previous versions of EZDrummer, it's likely you'll still gain useful information about the software. In particular the newly introduced features that weren't in EZDrummer 2. But as I said a moment ago, the course is really designed for anyone totally new to EZDrummer as software. As always with my musical notes courses, I don't want to assume all of you have complete understanding of every aspect of the software being explored. Yes, a number of existing EZDrummer users will already know every parameter and menu function. But you'll understand it's my job to ensure nobody is left behind, and it's for that reason I make an apology now to more established users. I'm sorry that what could be regarded to some of you as simple functions are explained as we progress. It's just that brand new users have no idea about those simple functions, and would need them explained, albeit briefly. Anyway, with that in mind, for pretty much each tutorial in this course, I'll split them into an initial brief overview explanation of the particular function being shown, before the particular function explained will be seen in action. For example, I'll explain how EZDrummer offers the opportunity to customize individual drums from any loaded and running kit, and why customization might be useful to you, prior to showing you how it's done and subsequently providing examples. I've chosen to do it this way, having the explanation of the function first, because it allows the examples that follow to be clearer and make more sense. Now, as an aside, it must be noted that EZDrummer 3 is related, of course, to Toontrack's flagship drum software, EZDrummer. When at version 2, EZDrummer was very much regarded as being inferior to EZDrummer, and there was a big price difference to underpin that. But now EZDrummer has reached version 3, it does remain different enough to EZDrummer, but is pretty much as good. In multiple ways, there are considerable overlaps between EZDrummer and EZDrummer. As a result of the overlaps, many users ask, why should they buy the more expensive EZDrummer if, as it's claimed, EZDrummer is very similar? Well, I'll explain one of the main differences. One of the fundamental differences between the two softwares is EZDrummer loads drum kits that are pretty much mixed and balanced and affected and EQ'd, ready for immediate use. The kit presently loaded in EZDrummer 3 here will display towards the top right, and that's this particular kit named there. Using the drop-down menu arrow allows you to switch to an entirely different kit. The amount of offered kits listed here is dictated by what extra drum kit expansions that you buy. EZDrummer 3 installs with a number of kits to get you started, but for extra creativity, Toontrack sells further kits for you to buy, and the extra kits are referred to as expansions. Later I'm going to say more about expansions. Anyway, each EZDrummer kit, whether it's one that comes with the main EZDrummer 3 software installation or extra expansion kits that you've bought, gets a number of related presets that utilize the core of the kit loaded up, but adapted with different effect and EQ settings to create alternative sonics from the same kit. The various available presets for the loaded kit are accessed with the drop-down menu to the right of the selected kit option. So, as a reminder, you would load a kit you like by choosing from the kit menu. And then, should you wish to alter the default preset for the kit, go through the drop-down list available to the right. One preset might be a very tight, compressed and dry version of the presently loaded kit. You'll see the preset names textually inform you of how it will modify the sonics of the default kit to create a different sound from the same kit. So, to reiterate, one preset might make the loaded kit sound very dry, whilst another preset might drench the same drums in reverb. As I said, they both use the same kit samples. Only the sonics have been adapted by changing the EQ and altering the effects and relative volumes between the individual drums. As can be seen, EZDrummer lives up to its name. certainly when contrasted with EZDrummer. EZDrummer offers an easy way of getting an immediate great drum sound that often requires little or no extra user tweaking. Yes, you can adapt the kits and how they are mixed with EZDrummer, but the ability to edit and enhance the raw samples is only available within EZDrummer. To compare the two different Toontrack drum software options with photo editing, EZDrummer is like working with JPEG photographs that have received internal camera processing prior to being opened with Adobe's Photoshop. By contrast, EZDrummer is like working with the untouched raw photographs that contain no internal processing prior to importing into Adobe's Lightroom. So, if you are the sort of person that likes to tweak every single nuance of individual drum samples and subsequently mix the resulting drum sounds, then EZDrummer might be the better option for you. But if you want an easy and quick way of getting a great drum kit sound, albeit without as much flexibility as EZDrummer, then EZDrummer 3 is the way forward. Anyway, before concluding this opening movie and moving forward to how we easily access and register any Toontrack software, I'll just give you some background information on EZDrummer and why it is regarded as the go-to drum software by musicians today. Arguably, its success has been built upon three fundamental elements. First of all, it provides very high-quality multi-sample drum sounds that form the various drum kits. Clicking on any of the animated drum graphics allows you to hear the sonic quality of the individual drums. Or by having a drum pattern loaded, you can hear the drum kit mix. Later we will go through exactly how to access the many drum MIDI files that give us different drum patterns. Predominantly the available kits are acoustic sample kits, though there are a few electronic kits too. Buying EZDrummer 3, as we now know, gives us a number of built-in kits and related patterns. But to get the most out of the software, there are many expansion packs available, and further expansion kit packs are released on a regular basis. Incidentally, I said a moment ago, EZDrummer 3 ships with some great kits. With them we get related patterns that have been specifically designed to run with the associated kits. However, you are not restricted to only using the provided patterns with their related kit. You can mix and match any patterns with any kit so that the utmost flexibility is offered. Furthermore, you can buy extra MIDI drum patterns, the expansion packs I mentioned earlier, to drive particular drum kits. These extra patterns obviously do tie up with their related kits, but they can just as easily be used with any of the kits that you have. So, to recap, EZDrummer 3 allows you to load a specific kit using the drop menu option up here. Each individual kit has associated patterns to drive the particular drum samples associated with that individual kit. Also, each kit has many presets available for you to use. As said, EZDrummer comes with many drum patterns built in, but if you prefer, you can program your own patterns in your DAW if that's the way that you prefer to work. So, while you can obviously create your own drum patterns using your preferred sequencer, in my case that would be Cubase, remember that EZDrummer does provide us with excellent and expandable collections of genre-based MIDI grooves that can easily be arranged into a song format. So, if you're not really a drummer and would prefer professionals to have programmed and played stunning drum patterns, it's as well to take advantage of the multitude of patterns provided. Finally, EZDrummer does provide us with clear and intuitive editing tools that let us finesse any of the preset grooves by changing their dynamics, intensity and timing to suit our compositions. So, with all that in mind, let's get started. I'll see you in the next movie. Now, before we do anything else, I want to talk about this program here, the Toontrack Product Manager. What this allows us to do is keep a record of all the different Toontrack products that we have bought, whether that's in this case the EZBass line or the EZBass sound expansions, or by scrolling down. Oh, just before I do, notice the EZBass line, it's got that red marker there, and so has the sound expansion section here. I'll just scroll down a little bit with my mouse wheel. You'll see that any sound expansions I've got are listed here. Okay, and because this is registered or indicated with that red box there, that red rectangle, that corresponds up here at the top right hand side with this vertical scroll. You can see that as I roll over it, it says that this is the EZBass line. If I want to come down to the EZDrummer line, then you can see that I need to come down to this orange section, so I can do that. I'll just scroll down. And then now, of course, because I'm here, we register in the main part the EZDrummer line here. So you can see I've got the original EZDrummer, the version 2 upgrade, and of course the focus of this particular course, the EZDrummer 3 upgrade. And it's up to date and ready to use. We can see I've downloaded it, it's been installed, it's authorized, and we would need to authorize with the register new product here. Although that said, when you buy directly from the Toontrack website, there is an option to, I think it's a checkbox, I'll have to check that actually. There is a checkbox option that allows you to automatically, upon purchase of any Toontrack product, automatically register the product here within the Toontrack product manager, so that you don't need to register it manually here with the serial number. You would only really use this, the register new product option, if you buy a Toontrack product not from the Toontrack website, maybe from a shop such as Sweetwater or a similar online shop like that, and you would buy it from them and they would provide you with a serial number. So you would have to enter the serial number here and register it, making sure, of course, that you are connected to the internet, and that will do it for you. But as I said, the quickest way and the most efficient way is buying it through the Toontrack website itself, and there is an option, I'll try and look for it in a second, that allows you to automatically, upon purchase, have that particular product, whether it's EZDrummer 3 or one of these sound expansions here, for example, automatically have it registered as soon as you start up the product manager. So you won't have to go through the authorization process. It's done for you. Okay, and you can come down and we'll look at the red section here, this more sort of darker red. This is the EZKeys line. So any EZKeys Toontrack products I've got, or EZKeys MIDI, then you can see these are all the ones that I've purchased over the years. And then coming down again, you'll see the EZMix line and then drum MIDI packs. Drum MIDI packs, important because these allow you to use these with EZDrummer 3. Coming down once more, we see the Superior line, so you can see I've got my Superior Drummer 3 upgrade here, etc, etc. Okay, so that's what we can do by using this vertical scroll here. And then you can see that all of my products are up to date at the moment, and these are all the installed products, and not installed. I've not got the Superior Drummer 3 library installed onto my laptop. They're actually installed on a separate hard drive that Toontrack sends to you when you buy Superior Drummer 3. And because I've not got that separate hard drive connected to my laptop at the present time, then the product manager thinks I've not got them installed. As soon as I connect that, you'll see that then this would change from download to install, and for all these other options as well. Okay, so that's the Toontrack product manager. And as I say, the most easy and more convenient way of registering any Toontrack product on your PC. Following on from our introductory overview of Toontrack's product manager, seen in the previous tutorial, I'll go through the process of buying a Toontrack product and using the product manager to register and download and authorize it to my PC. Now, recently Toontrack released an EZBass expansion based around the 1960s bass for the core program. We saw in the first movie how EZDrummer 3 runs as a core program with a few drum kits and patterns built in. Extra drum kits and patterns, called grooves, could be bought too. Well, the same principle applies to EZBass. EZBass is a standalone core bass program that contains a few built-in bass libraries and related bass patterns. But to expand EZBass, various extra bass guitar libraries get released too. Additionally, extra bass MIDI patterns get released as well. So, for this example of the product manager, I'll buy the latest bass MIDI pattern package. I've already got the related bass expansion library installed. Remember, the difference between the expansion pack and the MIDI files is the expansion pack contains the many hundreds of bass guitar samples of a particular bass guitar, whereas the MIDI pack purchase is simply a number of bass MIDI files that have been played, recorded and designed to work well with the associated related expansion pack. So here's the Toontrack website. I'll head up to the Products tab, and we now see all the Toontrack product categories listed. Obviously, if you want an EZDrummer sound expansion, you would follow the path here. For this example, as I said, I'm going to buy an EZBass MIDI pack. So I'll choose the option there to reveal this page of all the EZBass MIDI packs available. Now at first glance you might think there aren't many available to buy. Actually, there are many more available. It's just that I've bought quite a number of them already. So that I don't have to wade through all the products I've previously bought, I've got this checkbox activated. Hide the products I already own. And at present we see that is 12 of them. If I uncheck that, we now get to see all the available Toontrack MIDI file packages. I'll take it back to hiding the ones I've bought already. Therefore now it's much easier to roll over the ones I don't own so I can see if I want to purchase or not. Well, this is the one I do want to buy. Pure Pop Power, and the text says this is EZBass MIDI inspired by the pop of the 1960s. Remember, this is only a package of bass MIDI patterns. I've already bought the EZBass sound expansion pack made up of a bass guitar relevant to the era. In this case, a type of violin bass played by McCartney and the Beatles during the 1960s. Of course, even if I don't buy this extra MIDI pack, the expansion pack of bass samples, the particular library, can still be used. The purchase of the related expansion pack contains some extra MIDI files too. Additionally, any other EZBass MIDI patterns I own can be used as well. This particular MIDI-only package simply adds extra bass grooves designed with the particular related expansion pack in mind. So, selecting it calls open this page with a lot more detail about the MIDI package. I'll click the Add to Cart button. In true Toontrack marketing department style, I'm offered the opportunity to save money if I buy further products at the same time. For now, I'm satisfied with this MIDI package only, so I'll choose Proceed to Cart and work my way through the relevant prompts to make the purchase, including what method I want to use to pay for it. Once I've done all that, the page refreshes and I see my order details listed below, including the serial number to activate it. Now, as I said in an earlier tutorial, this is not necessary if I use the product manager, because Toontrack has automatically sent this number to the product manager and it will be recognized as my purchase once I run it. The only time you will need to copy this number is if you buy a Toontrack product from a third-party source, such as another online retailer. Anyway, with this now having been purchased, I'll head over to the product manager. Now, if you had bought the product from another retailer, you would enter the serial number once you click the blue Register New Product to reveal a field ready for you to enter the serial number. For this example, it's already been done for me by Toontrack. Now, just to be clear, this is only achieved if you have already signed into the product manager. I have my product manager running permanently with me signed in. This means once I open it, and connected to the internet of course, the Toontrack server sends the serial number to the product manager directly without me having to enter it manually and subsequently register it. Now, running vertically down the left here, we see these categories. Clearly we see this category will display all my presently installed and registered Toontrack programs. What I want to do is download, register and authorize the just purchased bass MIDI files. Well, all I need to do is click this category labelled Not Installed Products. As soon as I select that, the main display area to the right shows the just bought MIDI pack. There it is, and I simply need to click the Download Product button to do exactly that. Once I start this quick process in a moment, the product manager will download a zip file that contains the relevant installer. After installation, we can delete this zip file. I'll point this out again once I've downloaded, unzipped and installed the MIDI files. Downloading this particular zip file doesn't take too long because MIDI files are very small in size. We now get the red button telling me to install the product, so I'll click there to begin the quick process. Once this process is initialized, we see this installer. I'll accept the terms and conditions and hit continue, and then install, and there we go, it's done. I'll close the installer. So that's it done. The downloaded installer files that were a zip file can now be cleared from our system. Clearing the installer file will not delete the installation, that is now in place. Clicking the cleanup button simply removes the zip file of the original installer. So I'll click to clean up and then confirm I want to remove the zipped installer file. I think the only time you'd want to retain this zip file is if you want to make a copy of it and use on a different PC without the need to re-download it. Anyway, here it's now been deleted. It's not, to reiterate, affected the now installed MIDI files. They are still installed, it's only that zip package that has been deleted. Now, by choosing to view all my installed programs, I can scroll down to the relevant section to find it. Here it is. So that's a run through purchasing and downloading and installing any extra Toontrack program, and how we remove the installation zip file. Okay, I'll see you in the next tutorial. Okay, so moving forward now, let's now take a look at the default or main EZDrummer 3 user interface when it's loaded up and running. Now I suggest this is the default user interface view when we are looking at the Drums tab option. You'll no doubt have noticed that there are 5 tabbed and related user interface views, labelled as Drums, Grooves, Grid Editor, Mixer and Bandmate. Each of these views provides functionality for the presently loaded kit library and related chosen preset. Upon launching EZDrummer 3, we see this graphic, the drum kit, dominate our user interface. It's the animated graphic of the loaded EZDrummer 3 main room kit with the Studio Basic preset. Now we regard it, I suppose, as an animated graphic because it animates when we single click with our mouse on any of these drums, or if we have a MIDI pattern running in the horizontal MIDI groove area below, the whole kit simultaneously animates as the pattern plays. Incidentally, you can use this area below to place one MIDI groove file or multiple files as you build up a whole song. Of course, there's going to be much more on this as we progress, but it shares the same graphical principle as EZKeys and EZBass. By the way, if you like the sound of the kit loaded, the one that you've got loaded at the present time, but you'd prefer to program MIDI drum patterns yourself in your DAW, well, of course that is totally possible. Simply use EZDrummer 3 here as a sound module. Though, if you do it that way, I don't think you'll take full advantage or even get the benefit of the excellent patterns that come with EZDrummer 3, and the extra patterns that are provided with the expansions. Remember those extra drum packs and the samples that go with those expansions, and indeed the extra MIDI file packs that you can buy. Now I will look more closely at the Grooves view as we progress, but as seen earlier, we use this view to access the ever-expanding library of drum patterns that we can employ in our compositions. So for every core drum library that you have, and any extra drum expansion packs that you've bought, and indeed any further MIDI drum files that you've got, be those Toontrack bought drum MIDI files or third-party ones, you get them all appropriately categorized here by drum library first of all, and then filtered into different subcategories. When you begin to work like this, you would audition the grooves, choosing one and using its individual audition play button, or you could drag and drop below to start building the song structure. You might start with a single beat and then add a fill before going back to the initial beat, or even an adapted version of that initial beat. As I say, I am going to look more closely at this as we progress later on. Okay, so now moving along, we have the Grid Editor. By the way, you can click and grab any of these tabs at the top right and get that tabbed view to float freely. And then you can resize these panels. You would just simply grab right at the bottom there, at the bottom right, to resize horizontally and vertically simultaneously. You can drag at the right hand side, left hand side, top or bottom, but the quickest way to do it is by dragging the bottom right hand corner. Anyway, to send it back to the main user interface again, all we need to do is simply use the close down cross, and we see it there again. Anyway, the grid editor mimics the drum editor view that we've seen in our DAWs for years. The grid editor displays the individual drum notes or the hits by specific name, such as kick, snare, hi-hats, etc., etc. This grid editor displays the presently selected groove open on the timeline below. So in use we can edit any of the presented drum notes, anywhere across our grid editor. I'll move along now to the mixer view. This displays the individual drums for the loaded kit library as vertical faders, so that we can adapt their relative volumes and the pan positions and output bus. And we get the opportunity to solo or mute a specific drum too. Whilst we're here taking this first look, notice at the foot of these faders we get some dials. Now the amount will depend on the specific kit library that you've got loaded up, and these are global dial parameters to affect the whole kit. We can adapt these and the faders and the pan above to create our own presets too. You'll notice, as you adapt the presently loaded preset, the option there listed at the top right, the mixer view adapts to reflect that particular preset. Okay, and then finally, the last tab, we have Bandmate. Now this is a new function in version 3 of EZDrummer. It's a powerful tool and will take a little bit of time to show it you, so I'll discuss it in much more detail later. I'm just pointing out that it's here. Right, that's our initial overview of the user interface, looking specifically at the 5 tabbed views. Okay, so picking up from the previous tutorial where we were looking at the user interface, in addition to those 5 view tabs that we saw centrally, we see that we get an extra 6 menu options at the top left: File, Edit, Track, Settings, View, and Help. I think these pretty much speak for themselves, so I'm not going to bore you with every single option offered under each individual category. For this tutorial, all I'm going to do is, I'm going to look here at the File menu option. Incidentally, as you work with EZDrummer 3, you'll notice that many aspects of its functionality get duplicated, in the sense that you can access the specific function in a number of ways or places. So even though we'll be looking through these different menu options as we progress, you'll see that we can get to the same functionality from different places. Anyway, that said, if we look at the File menu drop-down, we see that we can start a brand new project. Let me just clarify that. Each time we start up EZDrummer 3, we get this default empty program. No MIDI patterns have been added. The song track below is empty. And in fact, the project and preset is untitled. It has no name because, as it stands empty, it doesn't require a name to differentiate it from any other project. So in other words, we would use the song track that runs horizontally below. You remember we placed different patterns along it, be they beats or fills, etc., to build up a full song performance. So I'll quickly do that. I'll add 2 or 3 patterns to the song track via the Groove tab view. Now I'm only doing this randomly, so you see the principle of building up a project for a specific song. Okay, I'll now go back to the drums view. So now from this point I can use the Project New option. Obviously to do that we would choose Project New, and then develop the song structure from that point. Alternatively, if we've previously created song projects, we would use the Project Open option. Now that's a good way of exchanging projects with other people too. Notice also, if you've created projects with the previous version of EZDrummer, version 2, then we would use the option there, Import EZDrummer 2 project. Simply trying to open up an EZDrummer 2 project using the Open option above won't prove to be successful, so of course it's best to use this option, the EZDrummer 2 Import option. If I do try and open up an EZDrummer 2 project with the Open option, we can't see the relevant file. Now I know I've saved an EZDrummer 2 project in this folder, but this Open option doesn't display it. The EZDrummer 2 project that I'm referring to used one of the expansion packs that I've bought. It's called Dream Pop and uses the Albino preset. It was just a very quick project I've cobbled together, shall I say, just to prove how this particular function works. So using the Import EZDrummer 2 project option allows me to access the relevant file. Here it is. So let's open it up here with EZDrummer 3 with this Import EZDrummer 2 project option. Okay, there it is loaded up, a simple and short Dream Pop example project. Now in terms of saving a new project, we get these textually self-explanatory save, save as, and save a copy options. Okay, now moving forward, if you want to check your preferences in terms of previously saved projects, select the option there, Auto Saved Projects, and fly out and choose the bottom option, Auto Save Settings. The Preferences dialog opens to the relevant Auto Save tab, the fifth one along. As you can see, there are only a couple of checkbox options here, Auto Save in Standalone and Auto Save in DAW. With the second option, the DAW option, you choose the time between autosaves. Now I'm just going to changing back to the default kit and the preset. Okay, now finally under the File menu, we get to choose what loads up when we open up EZDrummer 3. By default, we see this empty project with the EZDrummer 3 main room library and the Studio Basic preset. But by using the penultimate option under File, we dictate what loads when we start up EZDrummer 3. So if we want something different to be the default loaded here, we would use this option to specify our choice. For example, I could switch the default bass drum, the kick drum, to another one, and the snare to another two. I'm simply right-clicking those drums to open up the specific drum chooser flyout to flip over to a different kick and snare. When you do alter like this, notice that the preset name above, at the top right, takes on an extra asterisk to denote it's changed, and at this point not saved. If we saved, then that asterisk would disappear, and we would be overriding that particular preset with those two changes I've just made, changing over to a different kick and changing over to a different snare. Now that I've changed things over, using the Set Current to Default project means that the next time I open up EZDrummer 3, rather than the standard default that we've seen so far, we will see this kit change over to the kick drum and the snare that I've changed over, or indeed any other changes that you make. Okay, right, we'll leave it here and we'll progress further. Right, moving forward again, let's look here at the Grooves tab view. We know already it's here that we find all the many MIDI files that we have related to EZDrummer 3 drum patterns. If you think about it though, an issue of an expanding amount of MIDI drum files is raised as we add more and more MIDI packs, or indeed the purchase of expansion drum libraries that contain the samples and extra MIDI drum grooves to use. The main Grooves tab view here could become overwhelming as we expand with expansion packs. However, Toontrack has an elegant solution for this drum groove dilemma. We can filter from view any drum patterns that aren't appropriate for the project that we are building. At present, the default EZDrummer 3 kit library is loaded. I mentioned this to illustrate the drum library loaded has no bearing on what is initially viewable in the Groove window. So, as you can see, this Groove view is comprised of various panels. Just ignore the Tap to Find section there, we'll cover that later. Now at the top left is this panel that lists genres of music that we can filter into or out of view. At the moment, any is selected. This means every genre of MIDI groove is available to view and choose below. Now the amount of grooves displayed could overwhelm us. So let's assume our project is a blues-based composition. Selecting blues here means the amount of grooves below is filled to display only pertinent patterns for blues, and subcategories to the right update to filter further if required. Not only does the pattern window below adapt as it filters out non-blues type drum patterns, the list of kit libraries and expansions running vertically at the left gets some kits greyed out, those that don't contain any blues patterns, and the kits remaining are the ones that do contain blues rhythms. Let's filter now for disco patterns by choosing here. Of course the patterns available now updates, as do the kit libraries at the left and the subcategories above. Let's try electronic. These kit libraries are the ones associated with the electronic genre now. The more expansions that you have will mean scrolling down to view or access them all. Notice up here we see our filter choices indicated as a path of filter tags that run left to right. We can remove a tag should we want to by clicking its close down cross. I'll click to close the electronic tag by clicking the close down cross there, the individual one, and so then no filters now apply. And of course all the genres display, and we see the text there, no active filters or modifiers, meaning every single drum pattern that we've got is available to view at the present time because we're not filtering or modifying. Now to select multiple genres, use your Shift key. So I'll select blues, disco and electronic, a fairly eclectic mixture. Now each genre selected gets a horizontal tag listing just below, and an increased amount of kit libraries vertically down at the left. We can subsequently remove a genre tag by clicking the relevant tag cross there for each. I'll remove electronic, and then if I want to close down all of those that are still available, although there's not many now, if I want to close them all, just simply click on Clear All. That's a quick way of doing it if you've got maybe 4 or 5 separate tags set up. Something else that we can do from here is use the search field to narrow down a genre. For example, I'll type in the word disco. Now as I do, a list of suggestions with disco in its tag gets displayed. You'll notice each result displays if it's a library item or family item or genre item. In this example, I'll select Disco Vibes 116 BPM with the family tag. Now I'm just going to pause here and we'll look further at this groove view in the next tutorial. Okay, picking up from where we left off, we'll have a further exploration of the grooves view and what that allows us to do. You'll remember that in the last tutorial we left off with having this Disco Vibes 116 BPM search displaying all of these options to use. Do notice the family column. This indicates that search tag chosen, i.e. Disco Vibes 116 BPM. To recap, that's how this filtering or modifying system works. We choose to display drum files that have a search term or tag applied to them. Remember, it's just our method of reducing the amount of all those MIDI files, all those drum MIDI files below, so that we don't get overwhelmed by the amount that we have with an ever-expanding extension library. Anyway, I'm now going to revert to displaying all those particular files by clicking on the close down cross of the tag there. You'll probably guess by now, or at least have worked out, that the panels at the top allow us to manually filter by genre, play style, type, sign or signature, and power hand. So we get those subcategories there that we can manually filter ourselves. We will cover power hand later, but the power hand references the drummer's leading hand. We now know that each panel contains a vertical scroll slider. Genre, for example, displays more categories by scrolling down. Right, let's manually choose some filter tags. I'll go to the Play Style panel and choose Double Kick. And of course its tag gets added in the horizontal path below. Of course it's easy enough to remove if you change your mind. Click on its relevant close down cross. Now going over to the Type panel, maybe I want to view all the fills available to me. Well, I would just simply click and select Fills there. And consequently all the panels below are now fills. No straightforward beats get seen. All of these are fills, as we can see. But perhaps we would modify the fills that we see here. Modify further by ensuring we only see the time signature ones of 4/4. Notice also that clicking that 4/4 drop down arrow just to the right there allows us to exclude or deselect any 4/4 time signature patterns. Anyway, choosing 4/4 there means the next category panel to the right, the power hand, now displays these specific drum options. I'm going to scroll down, and by scrolling down I'll choose snare, now that that comes into view. Now of course the patterns below are now filtered to display our tag choices appropriately. Let's listen to some. Remember, simply use the play button at the left of each pattern. Here's one. Okay, and here's another. By the way, whilst auditioning, you can click there to favourite ones that you want to return to once you've finished evaluating others. Now that's a method of still retaining all the patterns in view, we don't filter any away, but we are visually narrowing down by activating the fave star button there. And of course you would click it again to deactivate, or simply remove the tag chain above as done previously. I'll remove all the tags and we'll pause again, and in the next tutorial we'll start building up, using any of these patterns, a basic song structure. I'll see you in a moment. Right, to reinforce what was textually pointed out in the previous tutorial, when we have any particular pattern parameter tag selected and we choose the option to exclude that particular tag, we subsequently display the results of everything except that search term. To indicate we have done this, the tag name changes to red. The exclude option reverses what gets displayed. In other words, having a particular tag selected and excluded means every available file except that particular tag gets displayed below. Obviously, this is a quicker method of displaying everything except for that specific tag from that panel's category than having to select all the terms except that chosen tag. Anyway, I'll return to where we left off previously. As said at the end of the last tutorial, I'll now quickly go through an example of building up a very simple drum track using some of the patterns found in the Grooves window. I'm using the EZDrummer 3 library samples, rather than any from extension packs. However, remember, we aren't restricted to using patterns from that core installation. The beauty of the library is we can choose patterns from anywhere. For example, I'll come down to this funk subcategory and select the straight 4/4 folder, and then move across to the next column and choose Funky Feel 109 BPM. When you see a BPM number appended to a pattern name, it indicates that that was the tempo the original performance was set at or recorded. We don't have to stick to that tempo, we can play them at any tempo that suits our project, but it is something to be aware about. It's likely that the patterns could sound more natural at or close to the recorded tempo figure. Nevertheless, with that information in mind, I'll audition them at the project's current tempo of 120 BPM. So, with the intro category selected, I'll audition patterns using the individual play buttons in the main view to the right. I'll try this one. Okay, that's fine for this example. I'll drag and drop it down onto the song track running horizontally below. Where you position the pattern is important in a real project. When independently building a track in the standalone version of EZDrummer, you can position from the first bar. But as often happens when working in a DAW, you have the project starting at bar 2, for example. Well, you would need to position appropriately. The patterns you use here in EZDrummer will need to synchronize with the bar positions in Cubase, or whatever DAW that you use. Now this only applies when utilizing EZDrummer as the pattern player as well as the sound source. If you drag and drop the patterns from EZDrummer to your DAW's timeline, you can skip what I've just said. Anyway, let's add another pattern here now as we build up a mock song. So, I'll use a pattern from the verse category. Now ordinarily I would audition it too, but I'm randomly using patterns here for this example. Obviously I'll position it after the first pattern, and then continue to build our track like this, using patterns from different song structure categories, such as the chorus or bridge or fills, etc., whatever is appropriate. Now obviously this is only a short example. In real life we'd build up verses and choruses and bridges, etc. repeatedly to get a conventional song layout. I'll play through what we've got in a moment, so if you don't want to hear it, you'll need to skip forward half a minute or so. I'll flick back to the drums window so that we see the animated display in action. Here goes. Right, let's leave it here and pick up from this point next, where we will edit the pattern lengths used to make the song structure more individual to our requirements. Now we've seen the simple principles of assembling different patterns on the song track timeline, let's quickly look at editing the individual pattern lengths. We can edit the notes contained within a pattern, and we can substitute the actual playback of specific drums, but we'll get to that later as we progress. For now, let's edit the pattern lengths only. Here's that hastily put together track heard previously. It's a combination of patterns drawn from different subcategories of one specific folder. Notice how the different pattern elements are automatically color-coded for quick ease of identification. Not only that, to make it even easier, each pattern contains text at the bottom left foot, stipulating it's been drawn from, in this hastily put together example, an intro, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, and ending. Furthermore, you'll see the color coding of the patterns is duplicated below as a horizontal slither of colored sections. Anyway, if we subsequently decide we don't want the used patterns to last their full recorded length, we simply need to roll our mouse over the edge. Left click and drag to shorten the length. For example, the intro section has now been shortened. It's not had its time compressed and sped up. It's simply had the end few notes, well, a couple of bars, cut from the length. It's had the length shortened. Now, left like this, upon playback, there'd be a couple of bars of silence. So by left-clicking the second pattern event, labelled verse, I can drag it up against the new ending of the intro pattern. Once done, I can adapt its length too, by clicking at the end and dragging. I'll move the yellow pre-chorus pattern along now. So far we shortened the first two patterns by dragging from the end of their lengths. However, we can shorten by dragging from the start too, like this. OK, and move the chorus along now and shorten its length. And finally the last pattern and shorten that. Of course, this means the playback will be much shorter than heard in the previous tutorial. Let's listen. Do notice the playback is just as seamless moving between patterns, even in their edited shortened forms. Here goes. OK, now to conclude here, let's look at one method of removing the patterns from the song track entirely. Right-click a pattern, the ending for example, and choose either cut or remove. In this example, both options would do the same thing. You don't have to remove them in order. You could right-click the pre-chorus now and choose to remove that. Then of course you'd need to slide the layer patterns forward in time to sustain continuous playback. Of course, to remove multiple patterns simultaneously, select them all by left-clicking and dragging over them so that they are selected, and then using the right-click contextual menu again, select Remove. OK, simple enough. Right, let's move forward once again. OK, now we've already seen how to move groove patterns to the song track, down here remember, and how to edit the patterns in terms of position and length. Here, I want to cover a bit more detail about the Always in View song track. Now I say it's always in view because it's always available at the foot of the screen, irrespective of which we have running. Drums, grooves, there it is down there, the grid editor, the mixer, or even Bandmate. So whatever happens, whichever of these that we choose, we're always going to have the song track running down here. What I'll do is I'll just start off by talking very generally, maybe about the playback controls here. Of course, we've got a loop function. As soon as we engage that, we'll see a looped area here. We can alter the length of that, just grab it there and drag like that. OK, so even though it's now disengaged, we can see where it's actually set up. It's a sort of lighter grey than it would be if we engaged that button there. Alright, grabbing the end means we can lengthen it, extending from the beginning as well. Grabbing in the middle means we can move it across to a different position. Alright? Then of course we've got the stop and play and record, a metronome and a count-in function here. We've got a time signature and a tempo. Clicking on here allows us to select either time signature editor, I'll close that, or the tempo editor, and we'll get back to that in a second. Okay, now I'm going to flick over to the grooves option. Now imagine I've got a couple of 4/4 patterns here. I'll just filter through and select 4/4 there, and I'm just grabbing one of these at random. Now of course if I place it here at bar 2, incidentally if I want to zoom in, just grab there and drag like that, and we can drag from the middle anywhere we want to as well, or from the beginning and drag. Okay, now it's a 4/4 beat, therefore each of these bars here has got 1, 2, 3, 4 separate measures. And remember, we can shorten the length should we want to, maybe we'll take it to there, but all the same we still get those 4 measures for every one of these bars here. Now that's all well and good, but imagine I want to follow this with a 3/4 beat, maybe this one, drag that down, and of course, because we are still set at the time signature of 4/4 here, this 3/4 pattern, 1, 2, 3, it lines up there, but it doesn't actually stretch to our next bar there, bar 5. So really what we should do is, I'll just remove that, select it and hit delete. Instead, I can come here and choose the time signature editor, and then if I place my playhead there, go to options, add a playhead, we now see that the time signature is still set at 4/4, but I need to change that, so I'll double click, change that to 3/4 time, and then now, I'll just zoom in and grab that close enough. This bar now has the required 1, 2, 3 before bar 5 kicks in. Now of course if I want to go back to a 4/4 time, then I would have to change that there, but let me just close that from view. There's our 3/4 time, so I can now drag this 3/4 pattern and it lines up exactly between bar 4 and bar 5. I can change the time signature from 3/4 at the moment by coming down to where it says sign there, and I'll change that to 4. So now we get 1, 2, 3, 4 measures in between each of these bars. So now if I come back to a 4/4 and drag down to there, I'll just shorten it for our visibility point of view. So now we've got a 4/4, a 3/4 and a 4/4, and it all lines up correctly with the time signature here. If I play this back, I'll just come to the drums view and play this back for you. Okay, simple enough. So that's how we can use the song track down here to change over our time signature whenever we feel that is necessary. Let me show you a couple of things that we can do now when we want to edit any particular drum in terms of the library that is presently loaded up. And then in a few moments' time, I'm going to change things around in terms of an actual MIDI event and the containing elements, the hi-hats, the snare, the kick, etc. So first of all, this is what this snare sounds like. I'll just click on it a couple of times so you get used to how it sounds. Okay, now if you notice up here at the top left, you'll remember we can change over the actual snare being used by clicking on here first of all, and then running down and choosing from this reveal list of different snares that work well with this kit. Each time you select a snare, we get to hear what it sounds like. Okay, now that's what the snare sounds like as it was recorded, well, all those different snares as they were recorded. But you'll notice that we've got a couple of dial parameters up here, labelled as volume and tuning. If we find a snare that we want to use, but we want to slightly adapt it rather than substituting it with another one, then of course we can do that with either of these two dials, volume and tuning. Left clicking and dragging down reduces the volume of that particular snare being used in relation to the rest of the kit. So dragging it down quite considerably there, when I hit the snare, it sounds much quieter. I'll revert it back to 0 dB, meaning the optimum playback level of the recorded sample. And this is what it sounds like, remember? Now, if I want to tune the snare so that it either goes up in pitch or down in pitch, then I would use this tuning dial here. It rotates in increments of semitones. Left-clicking and dragging up increases the semitone so it sounds higher in pitch, and then coming down, lower in pitch of course. I'll take it back to the optimum level, the recorded point, and there it is again. Right, I'm just going to flick over to the grooves view. We now know that we can select one of these patterns here. I'll just choose one at random, that top one, and use the audition button for that particular pattern. Okay, so that's what that one sounds like. Now, imagine I want to use this, but I also want to save some time and use other patterns within my whole library that are quite similar. I don't want them to be so different that they would be perhaps unusable. Well, if I right-click on the pattern, you can come down to this flyout option that says Show Similar Grooves. Consequently, we now see our filter adding about 8 different tags there, because we are now filtering to similar grooves taken from those particular categories. Here's a reminder of our first one. And here's the first suggested similar one. And the next one down. And the next, etc., etc. If I want to work with these patterns but in a slightly different way, then I can right click on the original one, the pattern at the top again, and then choose Select Containing Folder. As a result, we get very similar patterns because they are drawn from the same folder that they were all originally collected together within. So clearly these were designed to be played together. And there is that first one, and in this example, within this folder, for this verse part, we get an extra 2. As I say, designed to work with each other. Okay, now I'm going to click to clear all those tags, so that I now see all the different individual MIDI files. Next, I'm going to drag one of these down, this one, down onto our timeline, so that I can ascertain whether I like the groove and the individual elements that combine to create that groove. In other words, the hi-hat, the snare, the kick, the cymbals, etc. Obviously, playing the pattern on its own plays all of those elements together, as we would expect. But if I want to isolate, shall we say, the different elements, the different components that make up that beat, then I can right-click on the pattern and then run up to this option, Remove Groove Part, and then fly out, and I see a list of the components: a kick, snare, hi-hat pedal, and a crash. This will adapt and change dependent on the particular pattern that you have got selected. In this case, we've got these elements. If I select hi-hat, then when I play this pattern again, the hi-hats have been removed. Have a listen. Let's do that again. Right-click. Go up to Remove Groove Part, and this time I'll remove the crash from playback. Here we go. Okay, so quite a useful function so that we can strip out elements that we don't want to use, or strip out elements that we don't want to use, but replace with a different, say, hi-hat pattern or a different snare pattern or kick pattern. Anyway, I'll come up to Edit and undo a couple of times so that I revert back to the pattern playing back with the crash and those hi-hats that I just removed. I'll start playback to check. Okay, so back to normal. If I want to do the reverse of what I've just done, i.e. remove components, then by selecting up here, any of these patterns, I'll go for the same one, I can then come over to the right, pretty much centrally at the right, where we've got this button labelled Groove Parts. Once this is selected, we reveal these icons for all hi-hat, kick, snare and crash. The same elements as we saw a few moments ago, as we would expect. This time though, if I select hi-hat and then come over to the particular pattern and start playback, well, as you heard, we get to hear the hi-hats in isolation without the other components. I'll come over to the Groove Parts area again and choose kick. And of course, during playback there, we heard the kick in isolation. Let's try the snare. Okay, as expected, it worked. And finally the crash cymbal. There's only the one right at the beginning of the pattern. Going back to all, of course, now means we get to hear all the components playing back simultaneously, as we would expect. And coming down to our pattern on the timeline, it's important to remember that what we have on the timeline still remains the same, even if we use those groove parts and remove them. The pattern has been dragged to the timeline, the song track, with those elements complete and contained within. One final thing I want to do is swap over, say, the hi-hats. Well, by coming over to the last column over at the top right and choosing hi-hat there, in this example hi-hat closed, what I can do is audition any of these other patterns so that I can hear what those hi-hats sound like within those individual patterns, and perhaps I would prefer the hi-hat or the intricacies of the playback of the hi-hat in a different pattern, but have that in the original pattern that we chose. So I'll come to the groove parts bit again and then choose hi-hat. As we now know, playing one of these patterns, this one for example, auditioning this on its own, now plays that hi-hat pattern in isolation. Well, what I can do is come down here to where it says Replace MIDI, and with our event on the song track selected, having that pattern above just the hi-hats, we can now impose that on our pattern on the timeline, the song track, and replace, not add, but replace the hi-hat pattern. Let's have a listen. Okay, now if you like it, and I'm not sure I do, but you know, we're just trying it out. If I do like it, then of course to commit it to that pattern within the song track, then I would come over here, well down here, and click on Save Changes. Okay, let's have another final listen with the new hi-hat pattern embedded within that original pattern. The original hi-hat pattern has been removed and replaced with our new hi-hat, more intricate pattern. Okay then, so those are a few things that we can do to adapt the different drums, the actual sounds themselves, and the different components or the elements within a particular pattern. Right, we'll leave it here and we'll move forward once again. Before looking at the grid editor in the next few movies, I want to point out the 3 hand percussion elements that are graphically and sonically available at the top right of the drums view. As we now realise, clicking on any of the drum kit components allows us to single shot audition them. Well, the same applies to these hand percussion components too. The top one of the 3, presently a shaker, sounds like this. And there's the tambourine. And the hand claps option. I'll go back to the twist shaker option at the top of our 3. Now, a moment ago I stated this was presently a shaker. What I meant by that is we can alter the playback of the specific hand percussion by right-clicking and choosing another sonic option from this revealed list. Presently, the MIDI note applied to this emits the loud version of this twist shaker. Notice the soft option below it. Once chosen, the graphic updates and we hear a different sample. I'll go through all of these so that you can hear each. Okay, so those are the 6 EZDrummer 3 options under that category. There is an option also to choose EZDrummer 2 samples too. Anyway, the same sample switching principle applies for the other 2 categories too. Let's take a listen to some. Notice with these clap options, we get other sounds too. We get finger snaps and foot stomps too, etc, etc. Of course, as we now realise, each sample will have a particular MIDI note assigned to it, just like the main drum samples, so that it can be triggered here within EZDrummer 3 or within our DAW. If you want to see the MIDI notes assigned to each kit element, including these hand and foot percussion components, EZDrummer 3 provides a simple window for this. Right-click on any, in this case I'll right-click on the twist shaker, and run down to the bottom option available listed as Show MIDI Mapping Layout. Once selected, this detailed window opens into view. Every drum component is listed, even down to the different articulations of the same item. We see all the components textually listed next to a representation of a MIDI keyboard with the specific notes attributed to each of the kit pieces. At the moment, Selecting any of the samples by clicking the graphic does allow us to hear a one-shot playback of the drum component, but the component selected does not update here in the MIDI mapping layout as we select different samples. We can make it do that, and we'll do that in a moment. For now, the highlighted instrument on the layout, in this case the shaker, is determined by the field up here labelled Highlight Instrument. At the moment we have this set to shaker. That's why we see it highlighted at the bottom left with its MIDI trigger number. By clicking this field and revealing this list of components, we can change the focus by choosing a different drum or percussion element. There's the tambourine, for example. You can click on the MIDI keyboard to audition the relevant sample associated with that component. You'll notice the hi-hats have quite a number of different MIDI notes associated with them. This is so much more nuanced realism is heard as different strikes of the hats are recorded. The crash cymbals too. Let's change over to kick now, and of course the kick component takes on the orange bounding box to highlight it's now the focus, and the snare and crash cymbals, etc. Now if you want this MIDI mapping layout view to focus follow the drums hit on the main drums graphic, we need to open this view again and choose that last option, labelled Highlight Played Instrument. Now, as I strike different drums, the orange bounding box jumps to that particular drum as its focus. This works for the hand percussion too, of course. Okay, let's leave it there, and we'll move on to the grid editor view now. I walked through the options to swap different drum sounds in the previous tutorial, so that we could relate that to the grid editor. You'll remember we saw the different drum sounds have related MIDI notes that trigger them. We can use that information now to better understand how the grid editor works. First though, let's look at how we change the tempo when viewing the song track ruler. Well, I say we're going to look at changing the tempo, perhaps we'll get onto that next. But that's the intention. I think for this particular tutorial we'll just look at adding the notes, manually adding the notes to an event. So before getting to that stage, rather than using MIDI drum patterns found within our library of groove patterns, let's manually add some trigger notes to the grid editor view. First, let's check the MIDI note that triggers the tambourine. We'll open up the same window as we saw in the last tutorial, and by using the same method. Now we see the MIDI note associated with the tambourine is here. We can use that information in the grid editor, though I'll probably use that tambourine hit, those notes, when we do adjust the tempo in the following tutorial. So even though we're going to use that information in the grid editor, to be fair, the grid editor view does display drum names too. Obviously, to open up the grid editor, the quickest way is to use the tab up here. Okay, so there is the grid editor. Now I'm just going to close that and replace it with the drums view again, because I want to show you another method of opening the grid editor view. We can simply double-click a pattern found on the song track to open its particular pattern into view with the grid editor. However, at present, as you can see, we don't have an event on the timeline down here. So we can draw in an empty one ready for us to manually add MIDI notes later that will trigger specific drum or percussion sounds. To reiterate, we don't have a MIDI note populated pattern in the song track at present. So let's create our own empty one by using the draw tool found here. Left click and drag out a pattern length. I'll make it a random length. Now by default, though it looks like some hi-hat trigger MIDI notes are added, the pattern is actually empty. Now simply double click the event to open up the grid editor. As I said, it is presently empty though. Let's do that again. I'll draw out an empty pattern, despite it looking populated with MIDI notes, and double click to view it. See, it's actually empty. But we can solve that. Let's rectify. The pointer tool here allows us to select specific notes so that we can subsequently edit, remove or adapt their parameters. We also get, adjacent to it, the draw tool that allows us to add notes to the grid. As seen earlier, we get the names of the individual drums here running vertically, and the notes for that drum will be added horizontally for their time position. Here's the hi-hat lane. Let's use this tool to add some notes. Okay, We now see 7 hi-hat hits at these positions. Of course, we can add other drum hits too, such as the kick here. I'll add an extra hi-hat there. And now the snare. Notice this drop-down arrow for the snare. When clicked, we reveal these other snare sample sounds. Let's substitute a couple of those snares. If you roll over an existing hit, you'll see the cursor take on the minus symbol. Clicking the note now removes it. So I can add another snare sample at that position, this rim shot, for example, and I'll delete this note and replace with an edge snare sample. Let's go to the drums view and loop around this pattern and listen to it. I doubt it'll sound very good. Certainly it'll sound very pedestrian, but anyway, here goes. Okay, so that's what we can do when we want to manually create a MIDI pattern and add our own notes to it. We'll progress, and as I said earlier on in this tutorial, we'll look at the tempo and changing the tempo, perhaps with a tambourine hit in the following one. Moving forward from the previous tutorial, where we looked at manually adding a MIDI file, we saw how to open the event in the grid editor, either by using the grid editor button or by double-clicking the MIDI event, or at least so it seems. Now it does seem an odd option to me, going against convention I suppose, that we can view a newly drawn in MIDI event simply by single-clicking the event. Conventionally we would double-click an event to open it in an editor. Well, certainly that's how it works when we are using a DAW such as Cubase. Nevertheless, within EZDrummer 3 we can single-click the event to open the grid editor view to adapt the just created MIDI event. So with that in mind, and despite me saying at the conclusion of the last tutorial that we would now look at how we adapt the tempo of a song as it progresses, let's just recover that so that we see how to add and adapt an event. Here's that tambourine sample again. To check its MIDI note number, we only need to right-click to open this view once again. And there is the MIDI mapping for that tambourine sample. I'll close this view. Now remember, it's a simple process to manually adapt a new MIDI event by selecting this draw tool and then dragging across the timeline in the song track area. As a result, we see the default hi-hat height edge placeholder MIDI file added. Remember though, if we double click the event, it gets removed, and the grid editor, for obvious reasons, is now empty. So let's add that event again by using the same method of drawing it in. Now, instead of double-clicking it, when we simply select it, i.e. a single click, it automatically forces the grid editor to open and display the hi-hat tight edge placeholder groove MIDI notes, here comprised of kick, snare and hi-hats. We could lengthen or shorten the event as seen in earlier tutorials. Alternatively, we can use this split tool to cut the event into 2 sections. This means I can select the second section and hit delete on my keyboard to remove it, and only have the first section remain. I'll use the grid editor scroll bar here to bring into focus the bars now relevant, in other words, from bar 2 to bar 6 here. Okay, there are the kick, snare and hats notes once again for this appended event. If we want to edit the notes, we can do. We can edit the notes one by one, or by ranging over them, in this case over the hi-hats. We select them first, and then by hitting the delete key, we remove them. Okay, and now the kicks. This does now mean we have an empty MIDI event on the song track. So let's now pause before we look at adapting the tempo of the song as it progresses. I'll see you in a moment. Picking up from where we left off, here is our now empty MIDI event on the song track timeline. I'm going to add some tambourine hits. Here's the tambourine lane. So I can use this tool again and add the hits where I want them placed. Similar to the snare lane, we can click here to reveal further percussion sample options. So I'll add some shakers in between the tambourine hits, and I'll set the event to loop and take a listen. Okay, simple enough. Right, notice the tempo is presently set internally to 120 BPM. I'm going to adapt that tempo as time progresses. Bear in mind though, we can set EZDrummer 3 to tempo sync with our DAW, so any changes made by your DAW's tempo track will affect playback of EZDrummer. For the moment though, because we're using EZDrummer independently in standalone mode, I'll manually add tempo adjustments. Perhaps at bar 3 I'd want a slight tempo increase. So by placing the cursor there, I can click this button to the right of the tempo indicator to reveal these options. I'll choose Tempo Editor. The timeline changes to the tempo editing view now, and we see a horizontal line drawn to indicate the tempo set. Here it's at 120 BPM, but by going over to the right here and choosing Options, I can then choose Add Breakpoint at Playhead, and then choose Increase Tempo from the subsequent flyout options. Now by default, as you can see, that has increased the tempo quite dramatically from the original 120 BPM to 150 BPM, and we see the horizontal tempo line indicate that huge tempo spike. Now I don't want the increase to be so severe, so I'll double click the tempo field here and instead alter that to the slight increase of 121 BPM. Now I'll repeat that same process so the tempo fluctuates from 120 to 121 and then back to 120 BPM. Finally, and here's another way to adapt the tempo, I'll double click the tempo line here. This adds an adjustment at that bar position. So now I'll finally adapt to 119 BPM. Okay, let's close the tempo edit view, and I'll just zoom into the event area a little bit, and we'll take a listen. Keep your eye on the tempo field below, so you see the tempo adapt at those bar points. Okay, so that's how we can adjust our tempo using a couple of different methods. Let's move forward once again. Progressing again, we're going to have some further information about the editing functions within the grid editor view now. You'll remember that we can use the pointer tool to select existing notes so that we can edit their particular parameters, rather than adjusting all the notes globally. With this basic groove pattern comprised of a kick, snare and hi-hats, we can use the pointer tool to select a specific hi-hat note, for example. Do notice that running horizontally in the bottom quarter of the grid editor is this lane of editing options. At present it's set to display the velocity of each included note as a vertical adjustable slider. So to adapt the velocity of a note, select it, as we have just done, and move it up to increase the velocity and of course down to reduce it. I'll go to Edit and undo that individual note velocity change. We can also use the pointer, or the selection tool, call it what you will, to lasso around multiple notes, these hi-hats for example, so that they become simultaneously editable. Now, by clicking on any of the vertical velocity sliders, I can move the velocity of all of these selected notes in relation with each other. I'll undo that too. Notice too that we get some horizontal slider option here too that affect the selected notes. This one is labelled velocity 2. Dragging it to the left reduces the level, and to the right increases it. You'll see the vertical sliders below move as you adjust. I'll undo that. Now as I say, this lane here is presently set to display and subsequently edit velocity values. We see it labelled there, but we can select here to alter what gets displayed. Once selected, we get lots of MIDI options that we can adapt or associate with the particular drums. Incidentally, if you don't see this lane, you might need to reveal it by clicking here. Click to collapse from view or click to reveal into view. Moving our focus above the grid editor notes now, we see there are some fields up top here that make adding notes in time much easier. We see a snap field and a resolution field. These functions kind of work in parallel. The resolution is presently set to 1/8 notes, This means the main grid below displays eighth note division points. In other words, if I add any new notes or move existing ones, they'll be placed anywhere I choose along the eighth note grid marker points. Though I'll show you how we can override that in a moment. To make it easier to precisely lock notes to eighth note increments, we can engage the snap option to ensure the new notes are exactly at eighth note points. When snap is engaged, it takes on an orange bounding box. We're not restricted to eighth note edits only. I can swap the resolution to another division view, such as 16ths, by clicking here and choosing appropriately from the list of division points. Now I'm just going to zoom in a little so we can see the grid view more closely, and I'll revert to eighth note divisions. Looking at the grid now, we see the faint horizontal grid marker lines are set apart by eighth notes. When I change the division increment to 16th notes, we see extra vertical grid lines, though a little bit fainter. Though at this resolution, zoomed in at this scale, we can't see 32nd note division lines too easily. I'm going to go back to 16ths, and the grid lines accordingly adapt now, so that I can precisely enter notes at 16th note points or increments, instead of the 8th note positions when we started this tutorial. I'll open up the hi-hat lane now to access other articulations, so that I can add extra hits at 16th note points. There are now a couple of extra open hi-hat hits, and added precisely at 16th note positions because we have the snap button active. If I disengage snap, I can add in extra notes anywhere regardless of the division line grid points. So we can add in or remove free-form hits like this for a more natural playing style. It's less rigid when we add in notes like this. If we subsequently engage the snap option, you'll notice the new notes now snap to 16th positions once more. So that's what we can do to initially be precise with our note positions, and how we can also add a more realistic live movement to some notes. Okay, we'll finish here and I'll see you in the next one. I'm just going to give some information about functionality in this movie. So if you want to skip the information and get to the practical follow-up in the next tutorial, that's okay. Over the years, one of the things that people have criticised drum software for is the lack of realism that they seem to offer. Though it must be said, sometimes the lack of realism is required in certain types of music. For example, the lack of a natural sounding kit is required if you want robotic or electronic beats creating. However, I suspect and suggest that most people interested in EZDrummer 3 will want drum software that does sound as natural as possible. Yes, as I've said previously, Toontrack does offer some electronic expansion kits, such as those with electronic in their title. And the really interesting Dream Pop. Though ironically for a non-natural acoustic kit, Dream Pop is based on samples of real-world recordings from the natural world, such as the sound of twigs being snapped and rocks hit together, etc. Have a quick listen to some of the sounds. I really like Dream Pop. I think it's my favourite of the expansion packs. However, those expansion packs are in the minority. Something like 90% of the expansion packs, and indeed the core drum sounds that come with the program, are based around live acoustic drum kits. With the predominantly recorded acoustic kits, Toontrack does a great job of ensuring the provided drum groove patterns sound as natural and real as possible. This is mainly achieved by having real drummers create the provided grooves, so the beats and fills and intros and endings all sound exceptionally realistic. To be honest, I tend to use the provided patterns pretty much all the time. Yes, I will adapt them to make them fit the particular song being worked on, by adding or removing kick and snare ghost note elements and perhaps adapting the hi-hats and adding a crash here, etc. But there are many people that prefer to input their own grooves, drum note by drum note. That is totally possible, of course. We've seen how we can use the grid editor to add in our own drum notes. But when we do that, how do we ensure the patterns we create do sound realistic and natural sounding in terms of swing and groove, etc.? Well, Toontrack offers some great functionality in the grid editor that makes producing grooves with the natural slight timing issues that permeate a real drum recording exceptionally easy. And that's what we'll look at next, so I'll see you in a moment. Let's now look at what I talked about in the last movie. Now, you will have noticed every time I click on one of the drum instruments running down here, the ride for example, or a rack tom, whichever one of these, maybe a crash cymbal, or any of the different crashes, shaker, kick, snare, whatever drum lane is selected, we hear it. This occurs here, and when we add in drum hits along the grid editor, we get an audible preview of the particular drum selected. If you don't want to hear that, maybe because you find that distracting, then come over to Options over here at the right, and then simply choose Preview Sounds, found there under Editing, and just click to switch that off. So this now means every time we click on any of these drums, we don't hear it instantly play back to us. I'm going to turn it back on. I prefer the audible confirmation. So I'll come back up to Options, run down, and click on Preview Sounds once again. Next I'm going to add in some hi-hats. So I'll select the pencil tool there. Notice the snap option is activated. We know that means any new hits added will be positioned at that grid point, rather than loosely away from where we click to add. The auto resolution is set to 1/8 notes at the moment, though we know we can change it to whatever we want. I'll change it to 1/16 for this example. However now, even though I am adding these hi-hat notes like this, you'll notice that once they're all added in, down here in the velocity editing lane, the velocity values are different for each individual instance. You might wonder how this can be the case, seeing as I'm clicking to add hits with my mouse that has a fixed velocity input pressure. So why is that? I'll add some kicks in as well. Why is it that they have been added at slightly different volumes? Well, there's a functionality parameter reason for that. I'll just change over to the selection tool again. It's because this option here, Humanize Normal Regular, is activated. We know it's activated because we can see an orange bounding box around it. What is this function option? Well, we can see by the textual tooltip, when this function is switched on, when it's activated, it increases realism by adjusting velocity and micro timing of program notes, and it applies to selected notes and pencil too. So if I switch that off by clicking on it, you now see where it says Humanize, well, it's now off. I'll come over to the snare lane and I'll add some new snare hits in, maybe there. Now notice that any newly added snare hit is at full velocity and all equally added at that volume. We see by the adaptable vertical velocity sliders below the notes, any manually added snare hits are the same in terms of velocity values. Maybe I'll add another one there. Well, that's exactly the same. And another one there. They are all exactly the same velocity for all three of those hits. So if I just remove those two and come back to Humanize and switch it on, we can see that they have been slightly humanized in terms of they're not at full velocity. Now clicking on here, by the way, drops down and you can see that the velocity style is set to normal. And the textual tooltip informs us this applies realistic velocities to programmed normal time grooves. As you can see, we can switch this over to half time or double time. Okay, and the soft velocity and the velocities here, well, we can choose between soft, regular and hard. Okay, so we can see then that by using this Humanize option we can, as I alluded to in the previous movie, the information movie, We can add in the sort of realism only normally captured by a live drummer's performance, rather than adding very static or hard quantized notes here. This is in terms of the velocity values and also where they are positioned too. So there will be a slight micro timing adjustment of where these are positioned. In other words, they might not be exactly on the exact gridline beat position, despite us having this set to snap and the quantized resolution of 16th notes. So that was the follow-up tutorial to the previous information movie. We now see EZDrummer 3 has built-in function parameters that allow us to add realism to a manually programmed MIDI groove. Okay, right, we'll finish up here and we'll move on again. Let's now look at a function that allows us to search out and find drum patterns that match rhythmic criteria that we manually stipulate. So far we've found drum grooves by searching through all the patterns we have at our disposal. To help accelerate our searches, we chose and filtered by category that we felt best represented what we were looking for. If we wanted a funk pattern at 3/4 time, we would use those filter tags to limit what gets displayed in the results area of the grooves view. Here we'll use a different method of searching for drum patterns. We'll use the tap to find function found at the left of the grooves window up here at the top. Here in the grooves window we can select any of the patterns that are displayed below. Of course, all we need to do is click on the individual play buttons to hear and review whether that pattern will suit our requirements. We can choose a different library of drums and then move across to the right and choose from the subsequent subcategories. Each time we choose a subcategory, a new subcategory gets displayed, and then we can choose from the patterns that get displayed there. Now I'm just going to close down those filters, and I will come up to the tap to find option found here. Once selected, we now see a small grid at the foot of our screen and a couple of options at the top. By default, we hear the metronome ticking away, but I'll stop that by clicking on the play button here. At the top of the window we see these two options. They are labelled Click Accents and Record a Groove. The first option lets us use our mouse to click out accents that we feel will fit our composition. By contrast, the Record a Groove option gives us the opportunity to build up a rudimentary groove pattern that will be used to search through our vast library of patterns to find suitable similar grooves that we can use. When we choose the Click Accents option, just below a fairly large square appears that we will use to click on with our mouse to input accents as the basis of our search. When we click on it without starting playback, we will hear the audible sound of claps. Across the foot of the window we see these 5 options. The first is the Play/Record option. Of course, this starts the recording process and subsequent playback of what we input. The second allows us to stipulate either 1 or 2 bars are utilised when creating our accented beat. I'll set this to 2 bars. Next we have resolution. Now it's set to 8th note division points by default, but we can change this. I'll swap this to 16th notes. That gives me a little bit more accuracy. Moving along we have this tempo dial. Untouched, we record our accents or groove pattern at the tempo set by EZDrummer or our DAW. If you'd prefer to adapt the playback tempo of the tap to find function, and this is independent of the song tempo, we can dial this anti-clockwise to slow it down. You might prefer it slowed down to manually add in accents. Dialing clockwise, of course, speeds up the tempo. Now I'll leave it centrally positioned, so we hear playback at the same tempo as our project. The last option allows us to reset our parameters if we adjust them. So that's the principle of how the tap to find function works. Let's pause here and we'll put it in action in the following tutorial. Picking up from where we left off, let's start recording using the Click Accents option. Simply click here to start the metronome that keeps us in time. We now have the record option running with the metronome clicking away to keep us in time, as I say. I can either click on the square above to manually tap in accents, or use the bars grid below that I've set to 2 bars to manually add like this. Okay, I've now stopped recording accent hits with the play record button after a few passes of the 2 bars occurs and 3 accents have been added. During recording I did add more accents, but clicking them again removed ones I didn't want to include. I can even adapt the input accents recorded in stop mode too, like this. And we now have 4 accents in the grid. Once accents are added, the search button turns orange, in readiness for us to discover how successful the tap to find function has been, finding grooves from our library that we find suitable for our project. I'll click search now, and we automatically go back to the grooves window, and it is presented with search tags added to filter into view similar patterns to our inputted accents. The results presented to us are initially listed by a percentage value in this column called matching. We see the percentage values in descending order like this. The higher the percentage value, the closer the input accents match these results. If you'd prefer to see the results listed by family, click on the family column header here. The same results are displayed, it's just that now they are presented in a different order, and in this example the priority is by family. I'll go back to displaying by matching by clicking here again. If the results are now in reverse percentage order, click on matching once again to reorder with the highest percentage value listed at the top. Let's have a listen to some of these suggested results. To be fair, I think any of those top 3 heard would be quite usable. Anyway, I'll click here to clear the suggested results. I'll select the tap to find button again, and I'll stop the metronome playback. I'll ensure the bars is at 2 again. Notice how the horizontal lane below displays as accent when in the click accents view. This means that sound will play as we tap and add instances. However, if we switch to the record a groove option, we see we get dual lanes now for kick and snare. If we want a third lane, one for hi-hats for example, click on the hi-hat graphic above. This now adds that option below. Alternatively, click a crash to swap that hi-hat for the cymbal. You can remove a lane by clicking the X here at the right of the lane that you wish to delete. I'll hit the hi-hat graphic again to add it as my third lane. From this point I could start the recording process with the metronome clicking away to keep me in time, or I can simply add specific drum hits manually, without playback occurring, by clicking in the boxes below. I'll start with hi-hats, and now start recording by clicking here. I'll now listen and add or delete instances of the snare, kick and hi-hats to create a groove I want to use as my search reference. OK, done. I'll pause recording and hit the search button. Right, let's audition some of the suggested results. Now I'm not too keen on the first suggestion. It's too tom-tom heavy for my liking, though that's not surprising when we notice the family it is drawn from. This second suggestion is more to my liking. If you want to remind yourself how close these suggestions are to the tap to find groove you entered, click on this play button here to hear it. OK, And to clear your suggestion, click the X there. Right, that's the tap to find function that allows us to enter a groove we'd like to use as an audible search term to find similar grooves from our library. It certainly can save us a lot of time of manually searching ourselves. Now we've seen the tap to find function in the last couple of tutorials, I'll go back to the song track lane that runs horizontally across the foot of all the 5 tabbed windows. We have looked at this previously, I know, so want to explore further what it can do for us when we are creating song structures. We know we can build up a song by dragging appropriate patterns to the timeline and organising like this. However, we don't always know, when creating a composition from scratch, how we want to structure the song in question. We might want to try out a couple of alternate structures of the same song without having to delete each version. Having both song structures available to us allows us to easily flick between them to ascertain which we prefer. Well, that's what we'll look at now. I'll just delete those 3 patterns. Rather than dragging patterns into the song track or drawing out my own with the pencil tool, I can initially use this button labelled Add Standard Groove. As expected, this adds the default hi-hat, snare and kick groove that we've seen used previously as a placeholder. So now I've added a couple of groove patterns by clicking the Add Groove button twice. I know these are the exact same patterns, but I'll adapt the second one by adding some extra kicks and removing some hi-hats and possibly add a snare hit or 2. Anything really, just so we have a different pattern based on the first. Selecting the second event and using the grid editor allows us to adapt easily. Right, I've added those kicks and deleted some hi-hats and added a snare too. Now, as we build a drum track composition for our song, we might decide we want a fill for the last bar or 2 of the second pattern. Let's dig out any old fill for this example. I'll filter by selecting the appropriate tag there, and then choose a fill at random. This one will do, and I'll drag it down onto the song track. I only want to use a bar for the fill, so that one is fine. And then I'll trim a bar off the end of the second pattern and move the fill up against it now. Obviously, that's how we'd build up a song like this. But imagine we wanted to keep this version whilst also having an alternate version easily available so that we can quickly vacillate between the two to see which we prefer. Well, this is what we do. Notice over here this tab button labelled Track 1. This refers to the composition we have got going in view at present. Once I select this plus button now, I get a new track, albeit empty, that runs in parallel with our first track. Now I'm not saying that you can play them both and hear them simultaneously. This doesn't work like a multi-track recorder. I'm simply saying we have a second track that we can use to create an alternate drum composition to go with our developing song. With track 2 being empty, we can use completely different drum patterns if we like. Of course, we could also copy what we have on track 1 and make some minor changes if that's what we prefer. Though if it's a long track that we want to copy, that could take a considerable amount of time. A way round that is to simply copy track 1 over to track 2. I'll delete this existing empty track 2 by clicking its relevant close down cross. Now to create a duplicate of track 1, right-click on the track 1 tab and then choose Duplicate Song Track from the options there. Obviously this gives me an exact copy of what we have on track 1 and it's named as track 1B. I'll right-click it and choose to rename it. Therefore, from here we can adapt the track 2 version so that we get an alternate version but still based on the same structure. I can drag onto the timeline new patterns. I can edit what we already have. I can freely adapt this as an alternative version of track 1. So as you can see, this option to create multiple tracks is a powerful way for us to evaluate different versions of our song. Here we looked at creating a subtly changed version based on the same patterns. But you can appreciate how we could create a completely different drum structure, possibly a reggae version or a metal version for the same song. Right, let's move on. A few tutorials ago I looked at the grid editor view and how we can adapt the performance in terms of the natural timing of a MIDI part that we recorded. Now it's just occurred to me that I didn't talk enough about that, so I'll quite quickly follow that up here before I forget again. I've got a recorded drum groove here that was created initially in Cubase before importing as a MIDI file into EZDrummer here. To import a MIDI file is as simple as coming here to Track on the menu and using the Import MIDI file option. This MIDI file is nothing special, it's a simple kick, snare and hi-hat pattern. However, the timing of the performance isn't as good as it could be. Incidentally, every MIDI file brought into EZDrummer gets the same label attached to it, hi-hat closed tip. Infuriatingly, I don't think there's a way to rename it. It means every MIDI file that you import, regardless of what drums are included in the recording, will get named exactly the same. Yes, you can associate a song part label to it, such as verse or chorus or bridge, etc., but you can't actually rename the file. Well, if you can, I haven't yet discovered how to do it, so let me know if you find a solution. Anyway, before I correct it in terms of tightening up its sloppy performance, let me also say loose performances can be good too. We don't always have to squeeze all the life out of a recording. Nevertheless, I'll show you what we can do to correct the timing, so that you can decide just how much you want to post-record manipulate the performance. As I say, it's not terrible, but even without hearing it, you can definitely detect visually it was recorded live without a metronome to lock the timing better. By the way, click and grab here if you want to adapt the velocity lane footprint. You can even hide it if dragged down to the bottom. I'll expand now to its largest footprint. So let's look at tightening up the performance. As I say, zooming in as much as possible allows us to see the loose hi-hat feel. We see the notes are not exactly on the 16th note grid points. So to start auto-correcting within the grid editor, we need to click on this timing reveal button that displays extra parameters designed to make easier micro adjustments of the performance more tight. We see a quantize slider at the left. Now most of you will know what quantization is, I'm sure, but there will be some of you that do want an explanation of what it is. Quantization is a term that refers to the manipulation of MIDI note data so that its original recording can be subtly moved towards a stricter grid pattern such as 16th notes. The grid pattern can be whatever we choose, 8th notes, 16th notes, etc. Anyway, when employed, the quantize percentage slider here moves all selected notes to the nearest grid line by percentage degrees by the selected percentage value. Obviously, a full 100% adjustment moves the notes to the exact grid position. So if the hi-hat hits in a groove don't fall on the precise 16th note point required, as they don't here, for a tight or exact performance, we can auto-correct the timing with this option, instead of having to move them manually one by one. To reiterate, using quantization, we can artificially move those drum hits closer to where they should be in a 16th note grid in this example. So I'll select the hi-hat notes only, and they take on an orange border now, as do the vertical velocity sliders below too, to show they're the notes selected. So if I drag this horizontal quantize slider to the right, you'll notice some hi-hat strikes get moved, so that they align to the 16th note increments that we've set up, and that applies to every hi-hat note in this groove. It wasn't a big adjustment, but it was enough to force the timing closer to the 16th note grid. You can undo that by taking the slider back to where we were, at 0%, and the notes now return to their originally recorded positions. So as you can see, this is a non-destructive method of adapting the timing. We can adapt the timing of the snares only too if we want to, so that a looser hi-hat feel is retained whilst the snares get moved, and we do this by highlighting the snares only and dragging the quantization slider once more. It's very subtle, but there is a definite movement there for those two snares. I'll return to the starting point again. Remember, the grid the notes move to is stipulated in the resolution field above. We do get some extra functionality here too in the timing area. We get a swing resolution option, and that's presently set to 8th notes, but you can adapt that if you prefer. That creates a lively swing to the performance, either ahead or after the beat. In a swing rhythm, the timing of the groove is divided unequally, such that the subdivisions of notes alternate between long and short durations. Therefore, adapting the swing slider will move the selected notes into a swing pattern either forward in time, a positive swing value, or back in time, a negative swing value. There's also a randomize option to the right too, that moves notes in a non-linear fashion. This alters the timing of the selected notes in an ununiform way to achieve random timing. Now this can be especially useful when sequencing MIDI from scratch in the grid editor for a looser feel. And finally, there's a nudge option too. Nudge moves selected notes by a set amount, set in the grid editor options menu. These further options are actually more useful to us if we have the reverse of a sloppy performance. In other words, a performance that is too rigid. Using these options adds a little bit more movement to that rather static performance. Anyway, that's quite a lot of information, so let's conclude here now. Oftentimes, once patterns have been placed on the timeline down here, and a song is very much in development, it's useful to duplicate parts of a particular pattern, so we get a breakdown version of it. Maybe for a middle 8 section where everything drops out except the kick drum. Of course, we could duplicate the whole part in question and go to the grid editor and manually delete unrequired parts from the copied part. But there is another way, perhaps a more elegant way, to do this too. Here's what we do. Well, I say this is what we do as if there is only one way. There are a number of ways of achieving the same result, but here let's look at one of them now. Once done, I'll let you discover other ways of achieving the same results with context menus and indeed from the main menu up top. Now here's a pattern I want to duplicate a stripped down version from. Here it is in full first of all. Right, let's go about creating a breakdown version of it, with just the kick available in the second version. If I right-click on this part to call open the context menu, I can go to copy initially before pasting that copy to here. But with the paste option, I get to choose which elements of the pattern copied get transferred to this new version. Place your playhead first of all where you want to paste in the copy. Then, right-click to get this context menu. I can choose all drum instruments from the top there. Or, if I only want to add specific drum elements to the new version, I choose appropriately from the instrument section here. I can choose from kick, snare, hi-hat, and the related hi-hat pedal. Now those are the drum elements contained in the original pattern just copied. For this example, I'll choose kick. I'll have to move the pattern back a beat. I'd not placed the playhead in the correct place. Anyway, as a result, we now get a copy of the first pattern, but this time containing only the same kick hits from the original pattern. I'll open up the first pattern into view in the grid editor, so we see all the elements together. And now I'll open the copied version that contains only the kicks drawn from that first pattern. Let's take a listen to them both. Okay, now if I subsequently decide I only want the hi-hats to be heard rather than the kicks, right-click the event again and go to Paste at Playhead this time. We get the same kit options available to use. I'll choose hi-hats, and we now see those kicks removed and replaced by the hi-hats from that first pattern. If you'd prefer to merge your pattern with other elements rather than replace them, right-click the pattern once more but this time choose Paste on Selected Groove and then choose the other drum type to add to the hi-hats. I'll choose kick. Of course, we now see a merged version containing kick and hi-hats. Now I'm going to merge once more so the hi-hat pedal notes are added too. Let's have a final listen. The second pattern now contains all drum types except the snare. Here goes. So that was a quick explanation of how we base a pattern on another, but with reduced drum elements, so that we can build into our composition a breakdown section, for example. Right, I'll see you in the next one. So far, we've built up song arrangements manually. In other words, we've chosen MIDI patterns that we think will be suitable for our composition. There is a function in EZDrummer though that speeds up the process and takes out a lot of the manual searching for relevant or appropriate patterns. The function is called Song Creator, and one way to access it is by using the Song Creator button found here. At present I've got one pattern on the timeline that I want to use as the basis of the song. Now if I was manually creating a song, it would be useful to draw the patterns from the same family or folder that the original pattern is contained in, because after all, those patterns in that folder will have been designed and played to work together effectively and in a musically coherent way. So one quick way for me to find the containing folder is by right-clicking on the pattern and choosing Find, and then Select Containing Folder in Grooves. Of course, now I get immediately taken to the relevant folder the pattern is from. One way to use the Song Creator function is by right-clicking on one of the grooves found here and choosing Use with Song Creator. I'll not do that yet because I want to show you how to access the same options when we have the Song Creator view expanded. If you prefer this method, you drag and drop patterns onto the Drag MIDI Here area at the left. That's one way of utilizing the Song Creator function. I'll go back to simply right-clicking a pattern from the relevant groove folder and choosing one of the verse patterns that we like. But before I do that, I'll get rid of the existing pattern on the timeline first though by deleting it. So with this pattern in the folder up here, I'll right-click it and choose Use with Song Creator. As a result, we now see the Song Creator options that we can employ. Working from left to right, first of all we see the Arrangements section, where we can choose a song structure based on conventional song arrangements. You'll need to scroll down to see all the options. I'll choose one at random, this one. I'll come back to this in a moment. Moving to the right, we see two tabs, one labelled Arrangements and the other labelled Song Parts. Underneath, when looking at the Arrangements option, we see how that structure is mapped out. The different parts run left to right to indicate verses and choruses and middle sections, etc., and all colour-coded for the different sections too. If we select the Song Parts option button, we see other options that you can swap around. I'll leave it at the suggested structure and go back to the Arrangements view. Now, at present, this is only a suggestion. To commit to it, drag and drop that song arrangement down onto the timeline. Now I don't need this expanded view now, so I'll close it. And I'll zoom out too, so that we can see this song track suggested arrangement. We can leave this suggestion like this, though it's unlikely it will match our song exactly, so we would then utilize this as our starting point and adapt it as necessary to fit our actual song being worked upon. Right, let's progress again. When using the grid editor, we can adapt or edit the different drum kits easily enough. In fact, I'll just expand it into full screen view by clicking there and enlarging its footprint to fill the screen. With a complex pattern that features a number of different articulations for the hi-hats or snare hits, for example, we have functionality that makes accessing editing them easy. For example, as seen previously, if we want to access articulations for a specific drum or percussive element, we just need to click this Reveal button, found to the left of the three options next to the drum name. in this example the snare initially, to expand down into view the particular articulations for it, or open up the hi-hat articulations, or indeed the ride. Anyway, we can do this with any drum that contains multiple sampled recordings that capture the subtle nuances or playing styles required for full realism. Some drums don't have articulations. The kick in this kit pattern doesn't, for example. Notice too at the head of the drum list names there is an option labelled rows. When clicked, this gives us the opportunity to reset the vertical order of the drums listed below. For example, if you have previously adapted the list by dragging the hi-hat lane to the top and the kick below the snare lane, we can use the rows drop-down menu option to reorder to the default view by choosing the top option there to reset order. You can open or close all the articulation lanes using this option too. Click there and choose from the two options revealed, Collapse All and Expand All. At the moment all articulation lanes are collapsed, so by choosing Expand All, we see all available articulations in view now. I'll reverse that by choosing the Collapse All option. Additional functionality for the drum lanes is the ability to solo or mute particular ones with the two relevant buttons attached to the drum lane name area. To hear the kick in isolation, for example, clearly you would engage its solo button. Alternatively, to hear playback of all drums, except for the kick, we'd engage the M for mute button. Now something to be aware about though, if you solo a drum but have another drum lane selected, be vigilant about what's getting edited below. At present the kick lane is selected, and it takes on a slightly darker background to indicate that. Well, if I now solo the snare, the editing options below do not swap to the snare hits. We still display the kicks below because that's the track selected. Now I know this seems obvious when pointed out, but I confess I have inadvertently edited the wrong drums a few times when first using EZDrummer. Now the kick is still selected, yet I've soloed the snare. If rushing to edit, I now inadvertently adapt the kicks rather than the soloed snare that we would be hearing in isolation during playback. And that might confuse you. You think you're editing the snares because that's what you are hearing, but in fact you are editing the kicks because that's the lane selected. I'll show you that again. When using the solo option engaged for the hi-hats, for example, we now see the velocities for just the hi-hats listed below in the horizontal lane that runs across the foot. Soloing the snare means I hear it in isolation whilst also having the ability to adapt the hits below because the hi-hat lane is selected above. Anyway, I'll enlarge the editing footprint. We can now use the velocity slider to scale the velocities in relation to each other, either up or down. We could also scale the dynamics by using its small horizontal slider. We can take out all the natural dynamics or exaggerate them, depending on how we set this slider. Now obviously we can quickly switch between the different drums by choosing the snare and clicking on its name, for example, to now immediately switch over to editing those notes below. These functions are great because it means we can tailor the playback of the patterns to suit our taste. Now just before I conclude this tutorial, there is something I want to point out though. If you adapt the dynamics of the hi-hats, for example, by using the slider below and then deselect the hi-hat lane by clicking away, before reselecting once more, the changes that you made with the dynamic slider are now embedded. You'll see the dynamic slider doesn't jump back the notes to the default positions, i.e. where they were a moment ago. Instead, the hits remain at the previously adapted positions whilst the dynamic slider is reset at 0. Let's do that again. I'll select the hi-hat lane to make all the hi-hats editable and adapt the dynamics. Clicking away now to deselect means those changes are now embedded. Selecting the lane again sees the notes adapted dynamically, yet the slider is set to 0, ready for you to adapt further, but starting from this point. Right, let's move on again. When we used the Song Creator option a couple of tutorials ago, there was something that I was going to explain at the time, but somewhat ironically, the time ran away with me. So I'll just cover it now. For a change, I've got a different kit loaded up. I've got this hip-hop kit running and using the basic preset. This is what it sounds like simply by clicking on some of the drums. I'll go over to the Grooves tab and bring in one of the relevant grooves. For this to work properly with the hip-hop kit, I'll come down to the hip-hop kits category here in my Easy Expansion Libraries column. And here is the basic preset with its 3 individual patterns. Let's have a listen to some. Okay, they sound okay, but I would rather use a different preset. So I'll come up to the preset menu at the top right and then choose Raw from the preset list. And then of course I will now use the Raw category here and try some of these out. Let's have a listen. In actual fact, I think I will use that one. And I will come down to the Song Creator tab and open it up so that I can access its functionality. Remember, all I need to do is drag and drop this pattern down onto this area. Consequently, we now see this arrangement based on the top 12 bar basic arrangement. Now I prefer not to use that particular arrangement preset, so I'll scroll down and choose a different one. Textually, this one seems better for me, so I'll left click and drag this down onto the timeline here. Of course, we now see that arrangement running from left to right with all those different components and color coded appropriately for an intro, a verse, the pre-chorus, a chorus, etc., etc. There's even a bridge and an ending pattern at the end. Let's listen to part of this auto-generated arrangement. Okay, now that's the arrangement automatically generated for us based on the preset chosen. We can easily adapt it from this point onwards so that it suits our song better. We can do that manually on the timeline. Alternatively, we can choose the Song Parts option by clicking there, and this reveals different suggestions for the different sections. The top one here, labelled Source File, is the pattern initially used as the basis for this arrangement. You can preview it by clicking its individual play button. Below that, we see song part sections used and broken down into columns that contain other pattern options to consider as a replacement for the ones presently being used. This is a verse option. Okay, and here's another verse option. You'll see this arrangement contains 2 pre-choruses and color-coded as yellow for easy identification. Well, if I want to swap one of the pre-choruses for one of the suggestions listed above, and we aren't restricted to using only those labelled as a pre-chorus, I just need to right-click a pattern suggestion, this verse for example, and choose the bottom option called Replace Selected Blocks on Track. Obviously, you'd need to ensure the pattern in the track that you want to swap is selected. It is, so I'll choose that option. And we now see the original yellow pre-chorus pattern has now been replaced by this verse pattern, and its color coding has been updated too, to reflect it's a verse pattern being used. If it remains a pre-chorus in the song, you could swap that label as seen earlier. You could change it over to pre-chorus or whatever. Anyway, let's take a listen. Okay, so that's the essence of how this song parts option works with the Song Creator function. Let's move forward. We're going to look at the Mixer view now. Remember, the Mixer view can be accessed by clicking on the 4th tab along at the top. Now I'll do that in a moment. I've reverted back to the EZDrummer main kit that we have used previously. These are some of the sounds used and played at optimum level by clicking with my mouse. If we want to adapt any of these kit components, We would right-click and choose relevantly from the options offered to us in this flyout menu. Remember that we could also import our own audio file if that is what we would prefer to do. Remember also, at the top left of the drums view, whenever we click on a drum to hear it and select it, we see two options to adapt the volume and the tuning for that particular drum. We have seen previously how to adapt the volumes of all the individual hits in a mix by using the grid editor. We would select a particular drum and use the velocity slider below to adapt individual hits or all the hits for that lane. Now, as you can see, I do have a pattern on the timeline down here starting at bar 2. Let's take a listen to part of it. Okay, so we got to hear a blend of all the different drums being used and balanced in the way that Toontrack has stipulated as being a good mix. I'm not criticising that mix, it does sound great. However, if I want to impose my individual taste to the balance of the drums, I can do that by using the Mixer tab found up here. The Mixer view presents us with the individual drums being used for the loaded kit. We see some faders that allow us to adapt the individual drum levels, and for each of those channels we see a solo and mute button, and there are, in this kit example, some extra mix functionality at the foot of the faders that allow us to dial in more or less overhead microphone bleed, ambience mic sound, crunch and tape saturation. These dial parameter options change for different kits used. We also get access to a pan position slider for each drum component. So you can see the Mixer view provides us with the basic options required to adapt the present mix so that it suits our taste better. Notice too that some drums contain more than one channel option. For example, the kick drum has been recorded with 3 separate mics to capture the sound of the inside, outside and subsonics of it. Consequently, we can adapt the 3 distinct kick channels to tailor the sound more to our liking. The snare has 2 channels for the top and bottom mic placements used at the time of sampling. I'll start playback now to evaluate the mix as a starting point and adapt some of the levels. Being able to solo or mute channels helps us evaluate, so here goes. Okay, so that was a thorough evaluation. Remember, the Mixer view presented to us reflects the loaded kit, the presently loaded kit, and its components used. Of course, swapping over to a different kit presents us with a different Mixer view, but still based upon the same concept. Individual channels for different microphones that were used at the sampling time when the kit was recorded. Right, let's move on once more. Here I'm going to take a look at synchronizing a DAW with EZDrummer so that we can hear it in action with a composition in Cubase that contains the other elements of the song. For this example, the arrangement will be simplified to only a piano running in sync with EZDrummer. Nevertheless, you'll see the principle of how it works. So here in my DAW, Cubase, I've got a piano MIDI chord sequence with its sound generated from EZKeys. Additionally, I have EZDrummer running in sync. At present, there is no MIDI file on my Cubase timeline for EZDrummer, and this is because I have a MIDI pattern in place on the EZDrummer timeline. I'll open EZDrummer into view. As you can see, there is that drum pattern on the EZDrummer timeline. I want you to hear the piano in isolation initially. So, I'll right-click the drum pattern here and choose to mute its playback, and then close EZDrummer from view. It's still open in the background. So let's hear the piano now in isolation. Okay, so that's the piano sequence that I'm looking to have a drum and bass accompaniment running in sync with it. So I'll bring EZDrummer back into focus. Remember, I have a drum pattern in place at the present time on the EZDrummer timeline. It's positioned to start at bar 2 because the piano in Cubase starts at bar 2 too, and we want them to run in sync. Additionally, the follow host button is active in EZDrummer. I'll unmute the drum pattern. Have a listen to it first of all in isolation. At present I think it's too busy. Well, I know it's too busy. Nevertheless, take a listen. As I say, it's far too busy for the delicate piano motif being used. I do like it, but I wish there was a way to keep the same pattern, but get it to be played at half its present tempo. Well, of course I wouldn't be telling you all this if this wasn't possible. There is a way to do it. I'll delete the existing pattern first of all. It's no use to me played at the tempo it's at present. Here is that same pattern in the browser. Have a quick listen. As I say, too busy at that tempo. So, to half the playback tempo of the pattern, I need to have it selected here first of all, and then go up to this option towards the top of the EZDrummer user interface. At present this states original 1 times, i.e. normal speed. But if I click here, I can stipulate the tempo to be imposed when I drag it to the timeline. Obviously for my example here, I need to choose the top option, half tempo. So now that I've selected that option, I can drag the pattern down to the timeline, knowing it will now be placed there at half its original speed. Obviously with it being played at half its original tempo, the pattern length gets doubled. Let's have a quick listen to it in isolation without the piano. Okay, I think that's going to work better for the piano. Remember, the tempo might be half time for the drums, but it will still play in sync with the piano because the follow host button is active. Now, under normal mixing circumstances, I would reduce the drum level in Cubase if it's too loud compared to the piano. However, for the moment, I will reduce the level with the EZDrummer master volume here. So, let's take a listen to the drums at half tempo, effectively at 60 BPM, running in sync with the piano playing at the Cubase project set tempo of 120 BPM. Okay, I think that works pretty well, to be honest. It's still a bit too busy for both drums and piano. A bit too much piano going on, a bit too much drums going on. Certainly when we start adding different instruments later, it'll probably end up a little bit too busy for my liking. And ordinarily, I would be reducing what both play, but it's a good starting point. Anyway, I can leave the drum pattern there in EZDrummer, or I can drag it to the EZDrummer track in Cubase. I'll do that. Dragging the pattern out of EZDrummer onto Cubase means that I can now either mute or delete the pattern in EZDrummer. I have to do one of those, because if I left it running in EZDrummer, it will be doubled up in Cubase, seeing as the same pattern is there too. It will be playing in EZDrummer simultaneously in Cubase as well, and that will be too overbearing, and we'll probably start getting phase issues, to be honest. So I'll delete it in EZDrummer, and we'll play it again. This time though, the drum MIDI pattern is being sent from Cubase to EZDrummer, acting as a sound source only. It will sound the same. Anyway, here goes, have a listen. Right, that's how we can run EZDrummer in sync with our DAW. Let's progress. In this tutorial, I'm going to explain a function called Edit Play Style. I've got this straightforward pattern on the timeline. Take a listen. Okay, now the functionality being addressed in this tutorial is accessed once we click on this Edit Play Style button, found just above the timeline. I'll do that in a moment. Using this option allows us to modify one of the drums in terms of complexity. Well, we can modify a few of the drums, but only one at a time, as we'll see in a moment. So, with the pattern on the timeline selected, I can then click on this button to open up this graphical view of the drum kit once again. This time though, much of what we see in terms of the background graphics are greyed out, and this helps us visually and sonically focus on the drum elements. I'll select the snare to start us off. Whichever drum you do select then gives us access to the controls underneath, or you can click here to swap to a different drum. I'll leave it on the snare for now. So with this snare example, I can alter the type of snare strikes that can be adapted. I can choose to adapt all the strikes or notes as they are referred, or just any ghost notes, or indeed add in ghost notes if none exist in the pattern itself. Whichever I choose, we get to adapt the amount and velocity with the two dials to the right. Rolling over the amount dial at the moment informs us, for this pattern, there are 18 snare strikes presently embedded in the pattern, and the velocity dial is here to the right. Now at the moment it isn't a very busy snare pattern that I've got on the timeline, so I'll start off by selecting the Ghost Notes option so that I can add in extra flavour whilst retaining the same backbeat. Rolling over the amount dial now tells us that no ghost notes are presently included. Before adjusting though, let's have a reminder of what the pattern sounds like unadapted. Here we go. Okay, now if you happen to deselect this function, click the pattern to return it into view. Therefore now, once I dial up the amount using this knob here, the intricacies of the snare ghost notes become much more complex. In this example I've dialed in an extra 32 ghost snare notes. It'll be quite busy, but let's take a listen. As predicted, too busy. Well, certainly at that volume. So we'll reduce the velocity and take another listen. Now that's quite nice with the ghost notes much quieter. Anyway, I'll reduce the amount again, 8 should be enough, for a little subtle groove movement. Let's try a different kit component. I'll select the hi-hat graphic so that I switch over and adapt it with the parameter dials below. Left-clicking and dragging down decreases the complexity of the hi-hats whilst retaining the original kick and snare patterns. Let's listen. Great! I like the extra hi-hat strikes. If I want to reduce the velocity of the hi-hats in the pattern though, I can use this dial of course. I'm going to leave it. Now we've just adapted the hi-hat component because that's the element embedded in the pattern. In other words, the hi-hat is the driving stick of the two and the hi-hat is referred to as the power hand. However, if we want to change the power hand from the hi-hats to a ride cymbal, it's a simple process of clicking the hi-hat graphic where it says power hand first of all, and then dragging over to the ride cymbal, and this substitutes the hi-hats with this ride. You'll see the ride now gets that text box indicating it is now the power hand. Let's listen to the result. Okay, now obviously the way a drummer plays the hi-hats is different to the way a ride cymbal gets played. To compensate for that, we can click this drop down and choose a more appropriate ride style of playing. I'll start off by choosing offbeat accents. Now we might need to dial up or down the amount option to make it more subtle or realistic. Let's listen. I'll adapt the parameters and power hand style too as we do listen to it. Okay, sounds good. Finally, I can add in some shakers or tambourines or clap or whatever by choosing appropriately here at the top right. Now at present no shakers are heard in the pattern, but dialing up here gives us shaker patterns to choose from. Let's listen and adapt. Okay, now once we leave this editing window, the original pattern retains those adaptations that we've just added in and included. Let's have one final listen. Okay, brilliant. Let's move on once again. Okay, now, well, as we can see, and we've seen a few times already, the last user interface tab view here is called Band Helper. The principle behind Band Helper is very simple and is indicated by its name. It's a function that analyzes an audio or MIDI file of our choosing, and subsequently many EZDrummer MIDI pattern variations are suggested as a good basis to start from when building up a composition. There's a similar function in EZBass that we'll look at later. Here though, let's go about the process with EZDrummer. As you can see, the process is extremely simple. We drag a MIDI or audio file to here to begin the initial analysis. And you can see the suggested graphic options are guitar, bass, keyboards and other. Other being everything else, I suppose. Alternatively, we can start the analysis by using this select file option just underneath. I'll do that. And now I'm just going to navigate to the audio file on my hard drive that I want to use for this example. It could just as easily have been a MIDI file, but I'll use this piano audio file that was originally generated in EZKeys. The length of the file determines how quickly the analysis takes. This is quite quick here for this example, but anyway, once done, we see a dialog asking us to confirm the tempo and time signature attributes for the file. Here Band Helper has got the analysis exactly correct, suggesting the tempo is 120 BPM and running at 4/4 time. You can override these parameters if you prefer though. If you know the file was recorded at 116 BPM for example, you could change it. Anyway, I'm happy with these suggestions, so I'll OK that. Consequently, we now see the Band Helper view switch to this. We see the audio file analysed at the top and suggested EZDrummer MIDI patterns below. We only see one at a time in the main area running left to right, but we do get quite a number of different suggestions down at the bottom left. Each lane has its own volume slider, so you can balance between the two whilst you are auditioning. This won't make any difference to the relative volumes later. Now at the bottom left, as I've alluded to, we see multiple alternative suggestions that you might want to try instead of the first suggestion seen here. Below the main lanes, we see 3 parameters that we can adapt to increase or decrease the complexity of the main elements of the suggested drum pattern, snare, kick and hi-hat. The more you dial up, the more complex that drum element becomes. Now I'm going to adapt these as we progress. There are also 2 edit options to make the suggested MIDI patterns have more of a swing feel and a different velocity. Anyway, let's hear what the initial suggested pattern sounds like with the piano audio. I'm going to use my spacebar to start and stop playback. Here goes. Okay, I quite like that, though I think the suggested kick is a little too busy in places. So I can adapt the kick dial to reduce the amount of kicks that occur. Let's try that. Okay, right, I'll stop talking for the moment and just keep trying different variations of this pattern, and then try out some of the other suggested patterns listed by category at the bottom left. Here goes. Right, that was a thorough evaluation and adaptation of the suggested patterns that could work with the piano audio file used for the initial analysis. Let's leave it here and move on now to using the same chord sequence in Toontrack's EZKeys.